Good morning. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Good afternoon in Europe. We have a wonderful program today to talk about the Russian war in Ukraine, how things stand both militarily, economically, and politically. Actually, three things. We have a wonderful panel with us today. We have Lieutenant General retired Doug Lute, former Deputy National Security Advisor, also with the practice chair of the International Defense and the BGR Group. We have Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, who's the Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies, the Lester Crown Professor of Leadership Practice at the Yale School of Management, and someone who's done wonderful work on the Russian economy. And we have Lana Zerkal, who's a member of the Ukraine Facility Platform Coordination Committee, formerly Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and also very involved in all matters in Ukraine. All right. We have again, interesting conversation coming. Unfortunately, Mikhail Zigar had to drop out at the last minute, but again, we have a wonderful program. So, Doug, we'll start with you. What's going on the battlefield? What's going on with the war? We've seen Ukraine take serious territory in the Kursk Oblast of Russia since early August and beat off a Russian counteroffensive. At the same time, the Russians have finally taken the town of Vuhledar in southern Donbass. And we've seen Ukraine launch serious attacks on Russian military depots, ammunition depots, to great effect, both in the Tver Oblast and in Krasnodar. How does the battlefield look to you, Doug?
It doesn't look significantly changed, John. Despite the title of this session, I don't assess that the tactical ebb and flow along the front lines is all that meaningful. It seems to me we have a sustained situation of rough stalemate. And while we have eventually we occasionally get spurts of progress, like the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk and so forth, we haven't seen significant tactical moves, even though the Russians have made slow but very costly progress in the Donbass. I think more significant, based on your introductory comments, are what's happening on not the tactical or operational fronts, but on the strategic front. And here, on the security front, Zelensky's visit to the General Assembly last week, and then leaving empty-handed from his session in the White House, and what's happening economically, and in particular, what's happening with the Ukrainian energy sector as we approach what is probably going to be a very tough and cold winter for them.
Okay, thank you. And you teed up the next question for Lana. Despite the successes on the battlefield we mentioned, and also some of the setbacks, the energy problem looms large this winter. Given that the intensified attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure between March and May has left Ukraine with only around a third of its pre-war and electricity generation capacity by mid-year, what does the winter look like for Ukraine?
This winter will be a real challenge, and we're all aware about this. Definitely, it's very much different from the 2023, where our substations and electricity grids were under attack. Now we lack of generation, and we mainly rely on nuclear power plants. And just recently, before the visit to US, to the General Assembly, Zelensky and his team announced that our nuclear power plants, and in particular substations next to the nuclear power plants, will be the next target for Russian attacks. So this is a very dangerous message, and firstly, because we rely on this generation. These three remaining nuclear power stations, our main source of energy for this winter. And without them, it will be absolutely impossible to ensure not only electricity, but also water supply and heat supply in our apartments. So in this respect, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro are the most vulnerable points for the next winter time, because we rely mainly on the centralized water and heat supply. According to the official information, we lack up to 6 gigawatts of generation, which is 1/3 of our consumption during the peak hours in winter period. It means that we will not have electricity in our apartments and houses for up to 12 and 18 hours, which is very significant. So we all try to prepare ourselves for this winter. We buy battery storages, generators, and try to prepare our apartments for cold and dark winter. And also donors try to buy all over the world different types of equipment and supply it now to Sumy, Kharkiv, Odessa, which suffers the most from the lack of generation.
Thank you. We'll come back to this a little bit later. Jeff, the Russian economy, based upon Russian statistics, grew at around 3% last year, and I know you take issue with that, but it's still stuttering. Inflation is high. Russian government continues to overwork the economy's capacity to produce goods and services amidst military spending. What can we expect for the next year? Are Western sanctions having any bite? What more needs to be done? Jeff, are you with us? I think you have to unmute if you are with us.
I so dutifully muted that I only could hear myself, which I'm sorry about that. I had it muted. Yes, absolutely. If there's good news on this panel, I'd like to be providing some of that good news, which is the authentic bad news for Russia that often doesn't get through some confused media and the IMF, which we have time later in the call to talk about the role of the IMF in misinformation. But as Elena has given us this dire view of the Ukraine economy through energy, and of course Doug on the military stalemate, and we all, would of course defer to you on the diplomacy, John, is it's flipping to the Russia side of the equation, despite the dire circumstances that we just, of course, talked about in Ukraine, is Russia. There's some pretty bleak situation there. As you know, we helped to catalyze the 1,200 firms which left Russia, that non-Russian firms. This is the largest mass exodus in world history. That it's 6 times the exit from South Africa in the late 80s, which had a catalytic effect. And what's going on in Russia is just in the first months after the invasion, 500,000 people left. Now that's around 2 million people. There's been almost 500,000 people just going into Tashkent's technology part alone. These are highly valuable, skilled workers that are fleeing. The capital flight is as profound. There's been well over $350 billion in private capital that's been pulled out of Russia since the invasion till now. Russia's lost roughly about 40% of their millionaires have left. Loss of Western technology and know-how. Rosneft alone has had to spend somewhere around $12 billion more on capital expenditure by its own disclosure to try to make up for what they can't do on Arctic oil drilling and things, which were solely dependent on Western technology, and they've been halted. Foreign direct investment in Russia has come to a complete stop. Complete stop. There's only been 1 month of positive flows into Russia compared to 100 billion of foreign direct investment a year before. That's all stopped. The ruble, no matter what Putin wakes up and says about the value of a ruble, it's not an exchange traded currency. It's a complete fiction. There's a lack of access to capital markets there. Western capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid, cheapest source of capital, fund businesses, but nothing goes into Russia. No Russian company has been able to issue any stock and any bonds in any financial markets. The state-owned banks have usurious rates approaching 20% inside Russia. Massive destruction of wealth is plummeting. global multinationals that left, that the assets that were left there are not of value to Putin. They have dropped 75–80%. If Putin wants to stand behind the deep fryer at an old empty now McDonald's, that will let him. As everybody on this call knows, the lines around the blocks at those McDonald's were incredible. Now nobody goes into their fake version of it. The oil price caps have been extremely effective. They could be more effective, but more than 2/3 of Russia's exports were energy. That's more than sliced in half. And what they are exporting, they're not making money on. It costs Russia, because of their inefficient, anachronistic technology. It costs them around $45–46 a barrel to extract oil. It costs the rest of OPEC $22 a barrel to extract oil, more than twice as much to extract it. And the markets where they can send it, it costs them another $15 a barrel to send it there. Because of the oil price caps, they're barely breaking even. When we were working on the oil price caps, just between us, Poland, some Polish officials were pushing to try to set a lower price cap than the $65. It's right now they're at break even. We want that Russian oil in the global markets because it's break even for Russia. If that goes below break even, obviously Putin can't do it, but it's keeping oil global prices down, especially now with the Mideast. We need it more than ever, but it's not fueling, which is widely misunderstood in Western press and the IMF. It is not at all fueling Putin's bloody war machine, because they're making no money on it. This is what's and I should just close with, then, why is Russia still standing? And that's widely misunderstood, is that we could go into detail on this later if you have time, but they're mortgaging the future to pay for his bloody war today. They're running a massive unfunded deficit. Most countries are running deficits these days, but they get somebody to fund it. Nothing, not even China is investing in Russia. They're making money by taxing the dickens out of the surviving companies. Mainly what's left in energy, 20 to 34. The prices of the taxes have gone up to like 34–40% tax rate, which is incredible. But while the oil prices are capped, gas, they can't sell it. Putin has to flare off 85–86% of the gas, because he threatened, and most Western economists were fooled by this, when with his bravado, he said he'll just pivot and sell it to Asia, India, and China. He can't do that. Why? Because his gas is vapor. It's not. It's traditional natural gas. It's not LNG. So what does he not have? He doesn't have a network of pipelines into Asia. So they haven't been able to sell the gas. Now, if we have time later, I could talk about some things we could do. We're not doing enough in sanctioning metals, and we could do a better job even on enforcing the sanctions on oil. But right now, the price gap is pretty significant on Urals, on Russian oil, because of the effectiveness. And so, I think sort of that's, if there's good news here, the good news is Putin is counting on making it through November 5th with a Trump victory. If not, he's teetering on the edge of economic collapse.
Jeff, that's very interesting. Let me ask you something else. There's an article in Politico, the European edition, that Saudi Arabia was considering increasing production because other oil producers are not reducing production the way Saudis have. And if they were to do that, that's to drive oil prices down, which would be a major blow to Russia. What do you think of that?
The role of the Saudis is really complicated. And again, I could destroy your morning by going into depth on this. The Saudis have been really complicated. They were, as I told the White House a year ago and 2 years ago, that they're going into major price cap reductions. They're expert on the area, maybe friends of people on the call. Amos Hochstein got that very wrong. And it is, in fact, the White House kept telling me, oh, no, they're not going to have a meeting this time last year in Vienna for OPEC. And I said they were, because our sources said they were. We were right. And they said, well, they're not going to be OPEC plus. Russia won't be there. I said, no, they will be. They said, no, the Russian energy minister is sanctioned. I said, no, those EU sanctions haven't gone into effect yet. He will be there. And the Saudis will there. Well, it's not going to be in person. It's going to be, no, it's going to be in person. Well, there's not going to be a cut. It was a $2 million barrel cut. Is what we have now. Is we have the Saudis are way below their capacity. The Saudis are conservatively 35% voluntarily below capacity. They could do 4 or 5 million more barrels a day, and they did during the Trump years. Why did they stop it? Did they want to make Biden look bad, drive up prices, or do they just, I can't believe they want to help Putin, or were they doing this because they were just trying to get better prices, more profitable? It's backfired on them. Most of OPEC nations were not yet even reaching their quotas, and we've heard how Iraq is exceeding their quotas without punishment, which is the leak that came out in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. Is that while some countries are going past their quotas, most haven't reached them, and they want the cash. And the Saudis are frustrated as they have continued to cut. They are basically cutting their nose to spite their face. Their prices have still gone down. J.P. Morgan Chase and other experts were telling us we'd have oil at $450 a barrel. Of course, it hasn't gone much between 65 to 75, maybe 65 to 80 this whole period. Depending on what happens, obviously, in the next couple of days with Israel's retaliation and then Iran after that, we might hit $100 a barrel. But that's still the Saudis, have a really complicated role here. And if you wanted to jump way ahead to the the end of our conversation, is the Saudis, if possibly like Iran less than we do, if they really wanted to cut off Iran as a source of terror, they could take their capacity back up, because one of the failings, unfortunately, of the Biden administration has been a failure to enforce the still existing EU and US sanctions against Iranian oil, which conveniently is exactly 4 million barrels. They could have a substitute of one for another. U.S. can make up for the capacity too, but it'd be really easy if the Saudis were to increase their production, John, and that would then obviate the need for any of that Iranian oil, and we'd have a much stronger incentive to police what's already in effect.
Jeff, thank you very much.
Sorry you
Okay.
asked, huh?
No. I'm actually very happy that I asked. Milana, I know you've also worked on hydrocarbons. If you have any comment on that, please do it. Then I have a question for you.
Yeah, I worked for years in this domain, so that's why that is one of my hobbies, to follow these tendencies. Definitely, we saw how sensitive gas issues are for Russia and how badly it reversed to their economy, their intention to cut Europe from their gas. Now it's also a topic for the discussion in Ukraine and in Slovakia concerning the prolongation of the gas transit contract between Europe and Russia. And definitely we heard very loud statement of the European Commission concerning their desire to get rid from Russian gas in 2027. But at the same time, we also heard statement of the Slovak president Fico, who is eager to continue relations with Russia and wants to continue the transit gas contract through Ukraine. They very much depend on Russian gas supply, as well as Hungarians who are eager to continue enjoy low prices on Russian oil. Definitely, these countries are highly dependent on Russian energy sources, and Russia uses all these political instruments in their trade with these countries. We are in the middle, and it's interesting how Ukraine will behave and what will be the decision of our political leaders, whether to continue these transit contracts or not.
Thank you. Okay, now I have the original question I had for you for this round. The EU recently announced a major aid effort to help with energy supply this winter for Ukraine. Is the international effort sufficient for Ukraine's energy needs, and what else might be done?
It's like an emergency now. Definitely, we cannot cover all our consumption with generators and even with gas engines or gas pistons for this year, despite all claims that we might install 1 gigawatt of new gas generation. It's hardly possible. We mainly rely on European import on electricity, but it's also limited. Now, the assistance which is provided by the European Commission is mainly focused on maintenance on the current facilities. So we expect that we will be able to finalize this maintenance and that it will give us additional 3 gigawatts, but all these old facilities were targeted by Russians not once. So it's hardly possible to protect them fully from new attacks. That is why we cannot say that we will be in the situation where all this maintenance will be finalized before winter. European Union is also providing funds through the special facility, but this is not actually the sustainable one. We need the new generation, and we need more affordable money for the creation of this new generation, which is quite questionable, and the facility does not work properly yet. We have guarantees from the European side that our cost of money is still high for Ukrainian businesses to develop new generation. However, that is the only chance to rebuild Ukraine and to succeed in this war, to start building this decentralized generation, small stations in each and every communities, which will provide electricity in blackouts and in the situation of attacks and winter time.
Thank you. Clearly a dire situation. All right, Doug, reports of Iran sending Moscow short-range ballistic missiles in September point to an expansion of Russia's air campaign, precisely the sorts of things that can further destroy Ukraine's electricity grid. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said in early September that these missiles will be used within weeks against Ukraine. With such missiles assessed to be used for firing against short-range targets, how do you assess the use of these weapons impacting the battlefield?
Well, I'm not sure that they'll have an immediate impact on the Ukrainian front. It is interesting now, though, that Iran may have need for such short-range missiles as well, and that any anticipated flow from Iran to Russia may be stymied by Iran's own demands. I think, though, that, John, more broadly, any discussion of short-range capabilities launched from Russian territory against Ukraine and Ukrainian energy infrastructure, as we've already described, or other Ukrainian civilian targets, to include the fact that these short-range strikes are still imposing civilian casualties on the Ukrainian people. It points back to the fact that we, the West, have not provided Ukraine sufficient capacity to strike those launch sites. I mean, I know of, in military history, I know of no example of an effective air defense campaign that features only defense of the target end of the equation without extending the campaign in the opposite direction against the launch sites. And because we've been too little, too slow with long-range precision strike systems like the American ATACMS, sorry, terrible acronym, but it actually describes the system, right? ATACMS. And on top of too few in quantity, we've placed geographic restrictions and restricted their use on Russian territory. That's unconscionable in my mind. It defies military science, and it places an inordinate burden on the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and on the Ukrainian population. So again, however Russia strikes, whether with Iranian missiles or Iranian drones or Russian indigenous systems, I think there's a burden on us to lift these restrictions and provide meaningful numbers of ATACMS. And by the way, with the U.S. loosening its restrictions, perhaps moving forward with the British restrictions and the French restrictions on their longer range systems as well. And this is something that could be done almost overnight with a policy decision from the White House. And in terms of quantity of U.S. precision strike systems, this is a case where the White House needs to set a clear demand signal on the Department of Defense to prioritize the delivery of these available U.S. systems to those who are fighting today, which is, and not some future fight, and not insurance against some future fight, but actually prosecuting the fight that's at hand, which is the fight in Ukraine for its survival. So I'm strong on this point. This is crazy that we have not provided the systems Ukraine needs and removed any geographic limits.
I'll have a follow-up in a second, but just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, you can do it in askac.org, askac.org. Okay, Doug, why do you think we are not allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS against targets in Russia, which are bombarding Ukrainian cities and making the life of the Ukrainian military far more difficult?
Well, the conventional explanation is a concern, a White House U.S. administration concern about the potential for escalation, right? So how would Russia respond to such strikes? But I think that the last 2+ years of evidence refutes that concern. I mean, Russia did not escalate. Putin did not escalate after the collapse of his initial offensive on Kyiv, right? He did not escalate after the collapse of his forces around Kharkiv later in 2022, or the withdrawal, the more reasonable and organized withdrawal on the western bank of the Dnipro from Kherson. He didn't even escalate after his Black Sea fleet had to be evacuated further east, away from Sevastopol. And now he hasn't escalated, despite the fact that Ukrainian soldiers with American armored vehicles are occupying parts of Kursk province, Russian territory itself. So I think we now have 2.5 years of sort of evidence of where Russia's red lines are. And by the way, the Ukrainians are using indigenous Ukrainian-made systems to strike deeper inside Russia than even the ATACMS range. So there's a lot of evidence now about where we might have supposed Russian red lines were that might trigger escalation to the nuclear realm, and in fact where those red lines really are. So I think that's the conventional wisdom. Aside from that, behind that, I think there's bureaucratic inertia inside the Department of Defense that is keeping a large reserve of ATACMS in particular, but other long-range systems for potential contingencies down the road, and in particular with regard to ensuring deterrence against a Chinese attack on Taiwan. But look, we are in a fight now. So, I mean, it's a little crazy that we preserve systems for some imagined future fight when we are in a fight today. So I don't think either one of those explanations or supposed explanations, a fear of escalation or future contingencies, is sufficient to explain our lack of support in providing long-range precision strike.
Okay, Doug, thank you very much for that. Jeff, I know you've written on the Middle East as well. So your thoughts regarding Iranian supplies to Russia and what the delivery of Ukrainian missiles mean about the partnership between Russia and Iran? Unmute, please. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you very much. I think if I can, John, I'll try for a twofer on that.
Please.
Is that first? I just wanted to add to excellent points that Elena made, as of course our energy Zarina on this call. I would add how, just to make sure that everybody listening appreciates that when it comes to European dependence on Russian gas, it was overwhelming. Is pre-war Russian gas exports, 83% of Russia's gas went to Europe. Now precious little does. Europe was about 50%, almost 50% dependent on Russian gas. Now it's fallen to 4%. Now, that's not zero, as Elena reminds us. It's not zero. That's money going to Putin, but 50% to 4% is quite a change. Now, the Iberian Peninsula had long, Spain and Portugal created deep water ports and conversion plants to be able to receive LNG from elsewhere. When Poland and Lithuania presciently wanted to do this several years ago, German pride and economic self-interest was ridiculing to the point of almost threatening Poland and Lithuania for doing this, saying that they were just trying to undermine Nord Stream 1 and not be supportive of the prospect of Nord Stream 2. In fact, Poland and Lithuania went ahead and did it anyway, and the Baltics set a model. But I got to give Germany credit. After the invasion, they did an amazing 180 degrees flip. And in the kind of time that we would see China build something deep water ports, 6 massive terminals that were not even on the drawing board, no blueprints, no public discussion, no private enterprise plans, because it would undermine Nord Stream 1, of course, as it did, is they built these, and that's what then took the LNG from around the world and converts it back into vapor for most of the EU. But so what we have seen is, Norway, Algeria, Australia, Qatar, Malaysia, Trinidad, Algeria, Nigeria, Indonesia, soaring sources. There are now 40 more countries that are producing LNG because the market has grown, and most analysts missed it. However, Elena might still be saying yes, but, and she's right. What in the devil is going on with 4 countries that still lead to that 3 to 4% Russian demand? Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, those 3 countries, is Austria is still right now 60% of their gas is coming from Russia. Hungary, maybe no surprise to you, John, it's 80%. It's coming still from Russia, Hungary, and Slovakia. It's again, it's 60%. So those 3 countries are somehow not being supportive of this revolution in the gas markets. Now, when it comes to the Middle East, some of my best sources are the Atlantic Council. You guys just have a new report out, just looking at the links between Russia and this. If I had said this a year ago, it would have sounded, but it would have sounded conspiratorial. You folks have documented. I think it was Mark Katz who offhand, who wrote about it, taking a look at the not just the transfer of these Foth 360s. That Doug will laugh at my mispronunciation of the weapons, and the Fatah 110s that Iran has been sending to Russia, but then the Russian training of Hezbollah in Syria in Russian bases is now well documented, and we have also seen that Iran's new president has been meeting with the military ministers of Russia. Is that these are not isolated, unrelated events, and it's again, when President Bush 43 called out the axis of evil, and some laughed. There's coordination happening here without doubt, and there's a question just of how much, because Putin is so economically strapped, how much he can still deliver and help. And it's that's a big question. And in fact, Russia has just now cut back on some promised assistance to the Houthis that has this is according to Atlantic Council work, that has really upset Iran. But it was under pressure from the Saudis, of all things. Back to your earlier question, John, Saudis to Moscow. And the Saudis are taking quiet diplomatic credit for it. But the truth is Russia's so economically strapped, there's only so much reciprocal help that they can provide.
Thank you. All right, Doug, I'm going to ask you one final question, relying on your great knowledge of NATO, having been a U.S. ambassador there. We have the new Secretary General. He's now called on all allies to remove their restrictions on the use by Ukraine of their weapons. What do you make of this? That's a bit unusual. And do you think it could have an impact?
Well, my read of the Secretary General's statement, and it is significant that on literally his first visit, his first engagement, significant engagement as the new Secretary General, was to visit Zelensky in Kiev. So that's a very good sign. But he made clear that the provision of these systems, whether it's Javelin anti-tank systems, tanks, Bradleys, F-16s, or long-range precision strike systems, are national decisions. They're not NATO decisions. So there's in fact, there's no such thing really as NATO weaponry. It's all national weaponry. And he reverted back to the national prerogative, to include the one we've been talking about, the US decision, right, to place limits on that. Now, he favors no such limits, but he's not really in a position of authority in this regard. So it was a bit of a dodge. John, I want to just butt my way into another issue and throw it on the table here before we get too far down. I think there's another sort of overarching observation that bears consideration. I mean, we've talked about the linkage between theaters. So in particular, the linkage provided by the energy market, right? And energy flows. And Jeff and Elena have been good on that. I think there's another linkage, and that is that I think Ukraine and the Middle East have in common that our partners, and in the case of Israel, an ally, have begun to lose confidence in the United States. Now, what evidence do I offer? So we did not know that the Ukrainians were moving into Kursk province. And why did we not know? We might ask ourselves, and it wouldn't be a good answer, right? I think that maybe the Ukrainians didn't trust us to, first of all, keep this operational security, this secret, right? And then maybe they suspected that we would try to talk them out of it, right? Or even assert pressure. If you shift to the Middle East, we didn't know about the Israeli pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, and nor the attack on Nasrallah himself, right? This decapitation campaign against Hezbollah. Okay, why didn't we know? We might ask ourselves. I think, again, we have proven that we can't keep things confidential, and even then, that we would assert pressure on our allies and partners to reverse course and try to change their intent. We'd complicate matters. This should be troubling to American decision makers, that we are learning about these things via the open source news on the day after key events. And I think it signals something at the plane of grand strategy, that maybe we're not any longer, or at least now, viewed as a reliable and trustworthy partner. And that may have strategic consequences well beyond either the fight in Ukraine or the fight in the Middle East.
Doug, I'm certain you're right, but can I ask a question about that?
Go ahead.
Is given that, we're into the final stretch of this call, I'm trying to find a positive, perhaps Pollyanna-ish silver lining on that. Doug, is there any chance that this is Jake Sullivan wanting to provide some deniability for the U.S. to know what's going on there? Is there any chance that that maybe whether or not there are going to be strikes on the refineries, nuclear capability, which will be probably quite hard to get that deep, but whatever Israel does, that the U.S. Can claim, well, we didn't know what was going to happen, and as we just said, in the Nasrallah killing and things like that. This could be a tortured hope for an optimistic, but isn't there some chance that that the administration wants some plausible deniability of not being in cahoots on this?
Except that the president, as I understand, the president reported in an off-cuff statement to have said, we're thinking about support to an Israeli strike against Iranian oil infrastructure. So I think if there was an attempt for some deniability, I think it was kind of shot by that. As I understand, this is kind of one of these South Lawn en route to Marine One shouted comments that seems to refute the question of, of not being aware. I'm afraid, Jeff, if you want to look for optimism on this front, you'll have to go to one of the other members of this panel. I'm not sure I'm a good source for that.
The optimism is implicit in some of the conversation already, that while things may be problematic on our side, they perhaps may be even more problematic on the Russian side. Okay, audience questions. We have a question from Ken Zinnick, which is directly addressed to something which already came up. Will Iran's war with Israel reduce the number of missiles it's sending to Russia? Doug, do you have any thoughts on that? Or Jeff? Doug, go ahead.
Well, I mean, theoretically, of course, if the shipment has already been made, right? If the transaction's already been made, I don't see a reverse shipment. But it may cause the Iranians to be more cautious going forward. We'll just have to see. I think now that Iran has twice made historic attacks on Israel, suggests that Iran's got national interests that probably exceed its indirect interests in lending support to Russia. Its own security is now at risk. And what that probably means is that there'll be at a minimum a pause or a slowdown in future supply of Iranian systems to Russia.
Thank you. Jeff, you want to add anything on this?
Again, I yield to Doug's vastly superior expertise, but I would agree that it would diminish Iran's capability to be as generous, even if there was an economic return for it. They just won't be as strapped for future shipments. But yeah, those past shipments, you're not going to get them back, but that still will have limited ability to resupply Russia. But I do think to the extent to which Putin thought that he was giggling there as this great mastermind, it's just the way gas and oil have backfired on him, not having his bluff called, or the way he thought he could quarter of 2022, right after the invasion, so that when the IMF certifies Putin's false GDP, when he wakes up in the morning and puts out a GDP, as your opening question to me, John, of a 3% GDP, suggesting he's outstripping the growth of Germany and the UK and else places, which is absurd. Only the IMF buys that anymore. The World Bank, no major financial institution buys that anymore. But Director Georgieva, who has at best a checkered history leading to her exit from the World Bank, and I've said this on the record repeatedly, I have recorded on a Zoom call, just like we have right now with her top economists, perhaps accidentally checking the box, giving us permission. And I have their slide decks showing that they have certified having no idea what the truth is, because they've complained to us they have no visibility into Russia's actual, foreign direct imports, volume of air travels, or all the basic statistics that they are required as an IMF member to provide. Only North Korea doesn't provide it. 163 other nations provide that, but Georgieva has given them a pass, as they were going last week until we screamed out, this was outrageous. They put a sanctioned member of the Russian hierarchy as their representative to the IMF. The IMF has a very complicated role. Is there a question whose side they're on? No, there's no question. They're not on the side of the West right now. And the IMF is a severely misgoverned institution right now, and they certify Russia's false information. But other than that, I think the economy, by the way, that mission was called off after we put our piece out there. 11 European nations started screaming, how in the world could the IMF send in a delegation to help quietly advise Russia? And that the leak of that never came from the IMF. It came from Russia's IMF representative, which they regretted leaking that, I'm sure. So, I think Russia is just so strapped that, just like his IMF strategy backfired, the gas backfired, whatever dilly-dallying he was doing with Lebanon, Hezbollah, and Hamas and the Houthis, that too is now backfiring on him because he can't follow through on it. But this grand strategist, it's not working out for him. But there was a master plan, and I just think he's hit his limits. Putin, that is.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Darrell Brown of the Ravenclaw Reporter. Lon, I think this is for you. Are regions which are agriculturally sustainable under Ukrainian control safe from various forms of Russian weapons, such as conventional missiles, mines, and for that matter, biochemical weapons?
So we have suffered a lot, even in agricultural sphere, from the contamination after the shellings, and we still need to address this contamination. Definitely, especially in the south, where we have the most of production of our agricultural goods, our farmers still under the fire, and they still to have to harvest despite the war. We cannot say that we don't suffer from the chemical weapons because they use chemical weapon on the front line. Definitely, we cannot evaluate now the impact of this weapon on agricultural production. But definitely, agriculture and the possibility to sell agricultural products to Africa and other regions is one of our main source of income now. So we're highly dependent on the possibility to use the Black Sea as the main route for our agricultural products.
Thank you. All right. Doug, here's a question for you. It's from John Weiss, a retired from the Cornell History Department and also from U.S. Army. It would be of great importance to me and to other members of Together for Ukraine, the organization Together for Ukraine, and researchers at Cornell to get confirmation of reports that the 10-to-1 Russian advantage in artillery shells still holds in the Vuhledar-Pokrovsk sector of the Donbass front. Do you have anything you could add in response to this?
I don't know the tactical sort of balance of power, pardon me, in areas like that corner of the Donbass. I do know that the Russians continue to hold an advantage, and this largely beyond the tactical exchange rate, right? Largely goes to the larger, more strategic question of the two industrial bases, right? While Putin has been able to, despite the economic outlook that's been described here, he has been able to put his hand on the industrial base and demand production in a distorted way, but in the short term in an effective way to increase the production of military supplies and so forth, while we, on a more market-based approach, have been slow to do so. And despite Zelensky's visit to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the 155 millimeter plant during his visit to Washington or to the U.S. last week, we have made progress in production rates, but it has been slow, and this has largely been because, of course, much of our production is commercially owned and operated, which means that it's subject to market dynamics and it's got to follow the demand signal, which has been slow. So it doesn't surprise me that Ukrainians continue to report this imbalance in things like artillery exchange, but I don't have data on it.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from Jack Jarman, and this one's for you, Jeff. Despite Putin's claims for economic autarky, Russia's failure to create a competitive semiconductor industry has made it more dependent on the PRC. How do you think that its underdeveloped tech sector, Russia's underdeveloped tech sector, will impact its economic future and, for that matter, its geopolitical future?
Getting a question from Jack German for me is it's just like winning a gold medal. I couldn't be happier. And for decades, I've been waiting to ask him questions, but I had to rely on John McLaughlin to do it for us all. So, hi, Jack. Great question. Unfortunately, this one does put me a little bit towards the negative column with Doug, even though I'm trying to be the optimist here, is in taking a look at the flow of semiconductors into Russia. It's we had liked to believe that a lot of the sanctions evasion, there's a big problem with metals. We're not doing enough there, and some other fronts where we could do more. But when we actually take a look at chips, we'd like to believe that it's coming in from Hungary or Turkey, and there is some there, but a lot of that's apparel and other things, or getting a replacement screen for your Apple Watch, and 14 months after you've ordered it, you can get it and pay 3 times as much. But it's the chips issue. We're seeing some coming in from Kazakhstan. Well, I shouldn't have mentioned that because it was the ambassador himself who told me how they do it. They tape onto the sides of consumer appliances, microwaves, and refrigerators, military grade chips, as if they're replacement parts for these appliances. But the massive supply, 80% of them, and the U.S. government knows this, is coming in from China, and for various reasons, the Biden administration hasn't wanted to deal with that. But I can't say the Trump administration was great on this either. This was one of the late Ash Carter's greatest bête noirs, is when we had not just Huawei, but especially ZTE dead to rights as a massive proliferation violator, sending military grade chips made in the U.S. From China into Iran and Russia is pretty upsetting. Is a just below $1 billion of forgivable loan went to the Trump organization to bail out an Indonesian Gulf community. Ultimately, when that surfaced, the money was sent back. But that very same day, within hours, the sanctions against ZTE were dropped for absolutely no explanation anybody has other than that attempted payoff. And so no recent administrations can point to effective sanctions, but as they should be. But we do see targeting of chips, Jack, in that a number of companies, military grade chips, have had restrictions going into China. But it's just what's coming, from the U.S. But it's what's coming from China to Russia is a big problem.
Thank you. We have a question from Doug Brooks of FGI Global Solutions. I think this one's for you, Doug. U.S. contractors have been prevented by DoD from setting up maintenance facilities for U.S. equipment in Ukraine. While general maintenance can be done by the Ukrainians, often with telehelp from contractors, more significant repairs require the equipment to be hauled hundreds of miles to the west, and they keep them out of action for weeks. Can't this policy be changed by the Biden administration or the next one?
Sure. I mean, yes, policy can change. I don't see any indications, however, that we'll see a change in the next 30 days before the U.S. election. Look, Zelensky's best shot at shifting the momentum here. So the geographic restrictions on long-range strike, the presence of U.S. contractors for maintenance functions, as the question suggests, even beyond maintenance personnel, contract maintenance personnel, I would argue the policy limiting strictly the number of U.S. military personnel in Ukraine. So military advisors, or frankly, in a more self-interested way, military liaison personnel who could actually learn firsthand what the Ukrainians are doing to destroy a vast portion of the Russian army. I mean, this is in our own interest. We can imagine what's going on in the battlefield, or we can witness it. I mean, this is crazy. We will spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to replicate what's going on in Ukraine in our military national training centers, when for a fraction of that, and at very little personal risk, we could embed liaison officers inside the Ukrainian structure, and with a dose of humility, admit that we have a lot to learn from Ukrainians in terms of their ability to adapt and innovate on a battlefield. I was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago or so, and the innovation turn, that is the cycle of innovation, adaptation of a drone unit, a frontline drone unit, was stated as between 3 to 6 weeks. So it takes them 3 to 6 weeks to innovate from one approach, one tactical approach, to another in order to stay in front of the process of innovation. So there's a lot that could be done by way of policy adjustments here. I don't think we'll see anything before the election. I am hopeful that we might see progress on this front between the election and the inauguration of the next president.
Okay, it seems our questions are very heavy on the military side. So Doug, one last one for you. This comes from Christian Cabanis. Forgive me if I mispronounced the last name. How should our limited ability to actually produce munitions, both in Europe and the US, impact the aid we provide to Ukraine? And how does their usage in support of Israel, Western American weapons, impact that calculus?
Well, look, in some cases, there are systems that are needed by both Israel and Ukraine. So high-end air defense systems, for example, are in demand in both theaters, right? But I think there are other systems like 155 millimeter, like ATACMS, as we mentioned earlier, like support for the now emerging Ukrainian F-16 fleet, that should obviously it could prioritize support to Ukraine. Look, back to my favorite example here, ATACMS, right? Lockheed Martin. This is all open source intelligence, right? Lockheed Martin produces 500 of these missiles a year. They're at full production. Most of those missiles today are going to foreign military finance and foreign military sales contracts. Most of those are not going to Ukraine. There is a foreign military finance sale of ATACMS to Morocco. Okay, so one of the short-term and immediate impact policy decisions that the administration could take would be to reprioritize the delivery of ATACMS from the standard contractual FMS cases to Ukraine, just as the administration reprioritized the delivery of Patriot missiles some months ago. They should do the same thing today with long-range precision strike, move Ukraine to the top of the list, even if it means breaking or amending the contracts already written for other countries, right? Prioritize Ukraine, and then couple that with a policy decision to lift the geographic restriction. That could significantly change the dynamics on the battlefield in two ways. First of all, as already mentioned, it would be the complementary second piece of an air defense campaign because it would place at risk the launch sites. And then second of all, it would isolate by way of attacking Russian logistics, right? Which is Russian logistics are traditionally rail-based logistics. We could attack those rail sites and isolate the low-grade Russian occupying army because we cut off their logistics. These are two obvious military moves that are subject to policy changes.
Doug, thank you very much for that. It's true, if our policy was for Ukraine to win, we'd be doing all of these things. With that, I'd like to thank Lana, I'd like to thank Jeff, and as you, Doug, for a wonderful conversation. And for our audience, thank you for tuning in. We have more to come in the weeks to come. Thank you.
Thank you. A great honor. Thank you.